I'm honored to be presenting today with such an illustrious panel of speakers. I think it's going to be a really interesting day. The purpose of my first session here is just to really lay out some of the general ideas about OER, and then I think the various speakers will be diving down and telling you a lot more about their detailed work, both in terms of libraries and in terms of teaching and learning. As Marta said, the hashtag is OER21IE, and as I always do, I just have added a link to my presentation, and all of the resources and references that I mentioned in the presentation are linked in this open document, as well as some other associated references. So you're welcome to take a record of that. As Marta said, I work for the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education, quite a mouthful. We tend to call it just the National Forum, but we are a neutral, academically led body, for those of you who are not in Ireland, who are responsible for leading and advising on the enhancement of teaching and learning in higher education. And our vision is a valued and informed teaching and learning culture in higher education. And we have made a very strong and firm commitment to supporting open education principles and practices and policies. And my area of work is digital and open education. So I put at the bottom of the slide that you can see there a link to our Twitter account in the National Forum, but also there's a page on our website where you can find all of our resources in the area of open education if you want to follow up on any of those. So, but we're here today to talk about OER, and just when you have a variety of people talking about OER, one of the things I observed was that some people talk about OER and some people talk about OERs, and it's really the same thing. I use the convention of just using the term OER for the single and the plural, and that follows the convention of UNESCO and the Hewlett Foundation and so on. So when I say OER, I mean OER in the plural. And I could have put any number of definitions here, but most of them are very similar. This one is by UNESCO. And that is that open educational resources, or OER, are teaching, learning, and research materials in any medium. They don't have to be digital, though they often are, that reside in the public domain or have been released under an open license that permits no-cost access, use, adaptation, and redistribution by others. And the key here is the intentional application of an open license by the creator or copyright holder of the resource, whatever that resource may be. So it could be, at a very high level, it could be an open course, an open textbook, it could be a chapter or a journal article, it could be an assignment, a rubric, an infographic, a photograph even. So the granularity can vary, but this intentional application of the open license, excuse me, means that when that resource travels around wherever it may be shared, the license travels with it. So that anybody who encounters that resource, wherever it may be, knows exactly how they can use, reuse, repurpose it, and so on. If it does not have an open license, of course, anyone who wants to reuse or repurpose the resource would need the permission of the copyright holder. So this, eliminates that step, and obviously is very powerful in the context of teaching and learning. So we wanted to know a little bit more about you. I know you answered a couple of questions when you registered, but those of us who are presenting today, and maybe even all the participants, might be useful for all of us to know who's here. So I'm going to launch a poll. One is just asking about your experience with OER, and I'll share that now. Can you see that there? Thank you. Okay, so you can tick as many options as you like. Tick all that apply, and I'll leave this open for just about 20 more seconds. Very interesting. Okay, 10 seconds left. Thank you so much. Okay, Okay, so nearly half of the people who are in the session now have no OER practice but are interested. So that's, I mean, that's really useful for us as presenters and also for you to know about each other, I suppose. About a quarter of you have used OER. 40% support others in using and creating OER. I suspect that's a lot of library staff there. And then some people create and share, use OER in their teaching. And a small proportion, 14%, help to create policy. Okay. That's wonderful. And if you don't mind, I'll launch one more poll question. And in this one, we know we're going to ask you just to select one of these if you don't mind. We know many of you have multiple roles, but if you could just pick the role that best describes you, your primary role or where you spend most of your time. Okay, wonderful. So here, the poll shows that 85% of people here in the session are librarians or library staff members. So not surprisingly, and some of you teach, some support teaching and learning, a couple of students, a researcher, a few managers, and I'm glad we had the categories fairly well defined. So only one person said none of the above. Okay. Really appreciate that. That's going to just be very helpful for us just in terms of kind of guiding our presentations for the rest of the afternoon. As I said, I work for the National Forum for Teaching and Learning. So the context that I often speak about and support the use of open educational resources is the context of teaching and learning. And in that vein, we talk about OER as improving teaching and learning through the allowance of open access materials that can be shared and adapted by others. So that set of permissions that I talked about has been described by David Wiley as the 5 R's, as on the slide here. So, if you are, for example, teaching others or supporting those who are teaching, it's very powerful to be able to not just reuse, but adapt, revise, retain, remix OER that you might use for teaching so that you can adapt it for your own context. But it isn't just resources that we're focused on, because the use of OER actually has power and impact far beyond the actual resources. And that's really the wider context of what's called open educational practices, or OEP. And OEP is really a big umbrella to describe the use, reuse, and creation of OER, and also, as it says here, collaborative pedagogical practices that employ social and participatory technologies for interaction, peer learning, knowledge creation, and sharing and empowerment of learners. And this connection, I think, is really important because it's what OER enable in the teaching and learning context, where we realize a lot of the potential of OER. And of course, now we need to think about this, the title of this is about the present and the future of OER in libraries. So in 2020, certainly, we all experienced a dramatic change in the way that we work, no matter where we're based. But particularly in terms of teaching and learning. And as I have described over the course of the year, whatever any of us may have known about inequality before 2020, we certainly understand more about it now in the context of education, in the context of wider society, both in Ireland and globally. So the relevance and urgency of open educational resources and open educational practices has really been, revealed to a great extent this year, to many more people than would have been aware of that potential before. So UNESCO published a call for joint action in April, in the early days of the pandemic, where they specifically called on the global community to support the use of OER for sharing learning and knowledge openly worldwide, with a view to building more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient knowledge societies. And I see this as a call to action to all of us in education, whatever our role might be. And it really brings us to the question of why. And that was, this is the focus really of my initial session here. Why is it important that we're open in teaching and learning? Why should we encourage others to use OER and OEP? And I described the potential benefits in 3 areas. And again, I know our speakers today will be providing many examples in each of these, but those are in increasing access to education, furthering equity, reducing inequality, and enhancing pedagogy. So I'll just describe each of those in turn before giving a few examples of supports. So the first is access. And in this sense, we can think about teachers. So in this moment, with a focus on digital teaching and learning. There is a wealth of open teaching and learning resources that are available to all those who teach for accessing, adapting, and reusing. So many people have come to digital teaching and learning perhaps for the first time, or are engaged in it much more deeply than they had been before. And it's not required that each of us develop new digital resources for whatever we might be teaching, but that we understand that there's a wealth of OER available that we can, as I said, adapt and reuse for our own contexts. So there's a very powerful resources that is meant for many people untapped. So those of us who support teachers can help them to get on the on-ramp so that they can understand where they might find OER that are relevant to them, their students, their disciplines, and so on. For students, if students are taking courses where OER are used, so where teachers are using open textbooks or open resources, students have continual access to those resources. So they have access without incurring costs, first of all, but also without having to use access codes or without using resources that time out when they leave a module or when they're not students anymore. So this support of lifelong and life-wide learning is a key aspect of open educational resources. And then as the image there says, everyone is welcome. So, we could say, OER are available to everyone, but are they really available to everyone? It's important to say that they are potentially available to anyone, but really they're available to anyone with internet access typically, and the knowledge and skills required, or someone who facilitates people who don't have internet access to access those OER. And this is where addressing equity is important in any discussion of OER. And that's the second aspect I wanted to talk about. So if reducing inequality is our goal, equity is a path to getting there. And that's why we talk about equity in terms of OER. So ensuring that all of those who are marginalized in any way receive resources that offer the same opportunities as their peers. So for example, we know from research done by the USI and students and student groups in many institutions in Ireland and elsewhere about financial hardship that students have encountered as a result of COVID-19. And in many cases that exacerbated financial hardship that they had already. So reducing costs for students by not making them purchase textbooks or other resources, and having resources available persistently, not just when they're a registered student, is very, very important. So OER are available, for example, before, during, and after taking a module for a student. So if a student needs to take a break because they financially can't afford to continue their studies, they don't lose access to OER during that time. And these are things that perhaps don't come first to mind when we think about OER, but are very powerful from a student's perspective. And thinking about equity in another way, OER are open for change, so we can address diversity, equity, inclusion in some very interesting ways. So we can include perspectives that might be missing from the resources that we're using, if they're open textbooks or open resources, better represent marginalized identities. So for example, many of us will be used to using textbooks that will not be inclusive in terms of gender, race, culture, and so many other aspects of identity and social categories. So we can change that. We can expand and make sure that the materials that we use are representative of the students, the disciplines, the locations in which we're teaching. And finally, overall, in terms of equity, the use of OER enables us to support Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which is ensuring inclusive and quality education for all and promoting lifelong learning. So, this goal is one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But OER help us keep our eyes on the greater goal, which is better experiences for the students that are within education, the students we may be teaching and supporting, but also thinking of those students, those learners, those people who are not in the room. And for those of us who teach, for example, at publicly funded institutions or organizations, this is key. So enabling others to gain access to the educational resources that we're creating and using is really important and reduces inequality. So I'll go on to the third aspect, which is where there's great potential in terms of OER and OEP, and that's pedagogy, enhancing pedagogy. So I've mentioned before that we can adapt and use OER in our own particular context. So, in Ireland, in the discipline you may be teaching in library studies, for the particular students that we're teaching, in the Irish language, whatever that might mean for you. But beyond that, I take another step, and that is that students can also create OER. So it's not just about us sourcing OER that students can use, but actually students creating and co-creating OER, which opens up a wealth of opportunities for authentic assessment, which is a topic of great attention these days. And by students, by creating OER assignments for students, we give students the opportunity to contribute to public knowledge, to develop digital literacies, data literacies, copyright literacies, important aspects of lifelong learning. As I already mentioned, we can diversify the curriculum by editing OER that we might be using, and a whole host of ways that we can enable local and global collaboration. Because once we expand beyond the bounds of our classrooms and our VLEs, we can, as I have done in the past, and I know, probably Lorna and Stacey will talk about, enable connections between students that we may be teaching and students in other institutions, other countries, and so on. So what OER and OEP unlock in terms of pedagogy is very powerful and is really down to, the imagination and the will of teachers and students. So in terms of supporting these kinds of practices, the National Forum has created an OER OEP series, and there are 2 guides published so far. The National Forum Open Licensing Toolkit and a guide called How to Choose an Open License. And we're developing these iteratively. So we consulted a group of teaching and learning staff and librarians before we developed the first guide, which said, don't try and give people, loads and loads of information about OER, just keep it focused for particular tasks. So that was where the Open Licensing Toolkit came from. After that was out for a number of months, we had questions about which license should I use? So that was the provenance of the second guide, How to Choose an Open License, and that will continue. We also have recordings of various webinars that we've done and overall support, and we're currently developing an open course in OER and OEP for teaching and learning. So those of you who might be familiar with the National Forum know that we have a set of open courses, opencourses.ie. There is no course at the moment. There are many, many of them, but there is no course on OER and OEP directly. So Claire McAvinia from TU Dublin and the National Forum, Angelica Risquez from University of Limerick, and Celine Pegnan from Athlone Institute of Technology and myself have been developing a module that will be an open course. And we're planning to release it in quite an iterative way over the course of the coming months so we can get feedback from people. But it's not just, of course, the National Forum where you can find open resources to support teaching and learning. This is just a selection. There are so many, resources here, but there are numerous OER and OEP resources across Irish higher education that support digital and open teaching and learning. So the EDTL and the Digital Ed program, for example, are projects funded by the HEA Innovation and Transformation Fund. All Aboard and Open Teach received funding from the National Forum. The recently launched LibGuide and subject indexes from AIT was developed with the National Forum LEP funding. And then there are so many resources developed within institutions. I'm aware of only some of them. But so there are many resources. I don't mean to say that the National Forum is the only one, but we try and keep an eye and be able to share and amplify what institutions are doing. And in the sense of fostering and encouraging a critical approach to open, I just want to recommend this collection of articles that was published earlier in 2020, which focus on diverse and marginalized voices talking about OER and OEP. So if what I've said here today, perhaps about equity, is something that's new to you and you're interested in exploring that further, there are, I think, 32 different authors here. Lorna Campbell has an article in this. Some are, group authored. I have a piece in there, and just very, very different interpretations of how to further equity through the use of OER and REP. So again, this is included in the document that I shared at the start. The important thing I want to say before I begin wrapping up is that many times we, as people who support OER and OEP, get stuck in the nuts and bolts about the licenses and the repositories. And when what I'm suggesting here and what I hope will come out today in many ways is keeping our keeping our attention on the values behind OER and OEP. Why are we doing this often really helps in the process, and also really in how we might support people. So again, increasing access to education, fostering and furthering equity, and enhancing pedagogy. That's really why we would use OER and OEP in teaching and learning. And I think we would probably all agree that a collaborative systemic approach is key. So, I mean, if we go from the upper left, over to the right, you might see some metaphors here for how some of us might work, in our work in OER and OEP. Sometimes we work with an individual person, helping them to get, to incorporate OER in a course, or to create an open textbook, or even to understand open licensing. But we can expand that further. We could work with course teams, with programs, with disciplines. We really need to work across institutions and think about policy as well as practice in terms of openness. And then my domain, I suppose, the National Forum is this thinking across the sector, across all the different types of institutions. How best can we support openness? And we no one of us really has the view of this, and all of what we're doing together will further, the open agenda and really realize the potential of open. But, we need all of this. We need all of us working in all of these different ways, I think is the key. And finally, I was starting to prepare a slide of what I thought my key takeaways would be. And I realized that they were just about the same bullets as the 5 actions that UNESCO published in their recommendation on open educational resources in 2019. So I have to, I'll let UNESCO describe it because they do it best. These are really 5 key actions. And again, they're 5 actions that are part of my own work and perhaps your own. And that is building capacity of stakeholders, across education to be able to access, use, adapt, create, share, understand OER. Develop supportive policy. And this is probably one of the biggest impediments to realizing the potential of open in institutions, I would say. And, as I've said in the past, based on my own practice and research that I have done in the area of OEP, the lack of supportive policy speaks very loudly to people. So if there is no coherent OER strategy in the institution, or if the IP strategy is not conducive to open, then it'll be very difficult to further open practice within your institution. So this is a key area. We need to support and enable inclusive and equitable quality OER. And that is just really about expanding our definition of what quality is. So in the domain of open access of research outputs, we have a very clear idea of what quality is. But in terms of open educational resources, sharing teaching and learning resources openly, it isn't just enough that they be produced in a quality way. If that is our only measure of quality, then we will only be approving and sharing OER that were developed by, elite institutions in the global north. They will not be equitable, they will not be inclusive. So let's expand the definition of quality when we talk about quality OER. We need to nurture the creation of sustainability models for OER. I know there are projects going on in that in higher education at the moment. That's really key. And finally, facilitating international collaboration, which is this webinar today is such a great example. I know my own practice has been immensely informed by and inspired by practice at places like University of Edinburgh, where Lorna is, City University of New York, where Stacey is, the University of Cape Town, BC campus, other examples. So we can learn, if we think where our practice isn't where others may be, we can learn from them, because the whole point of open practice is people share what they're doing, why they do it, how they do it, which is a beautiful way to learn from others' practice. So my last slide is just a note of hope. In these times, I think this is very important. And, there are so many challenges we face at the moment, due to COVID and in other ways, funding in higher education, resourcing, and so on. But the ethos of open education, some of the people who I've been most inspired by, to deal with the challenges, in my own work have been people working in open education, many of whom are in the webinar today. So I love this quote by Rebecca Solnit with a beautiful image, open public domain image from the New York Public Library. And that's it. I think I'll stop there. Thank you all so much. And I really look forward to the conversation.